James Washington, successful black CEO of TechVision Enterprises, sat in first class on flight MH249 to San Francisco. White flight attendant Meredith approached, asking him to move to economy for a VIP passenger. James stood up, pulled out his phone, made a call that grounded the entire plane. Before we dive into what happened next in this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed discrimination while traveling, this story might hit close to home. Hit that like button and subscribe to see more real stories about standing up to injustice in everyday situations. James Washington wasn't just any passenger on flight MH249. At 43 years old, he was the self-made founder and CEO of TechVision Enterprises, a company he had built from nothing into a $350 million tech powerhouse. His journey to success had been anything but easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Oakland, California, James had learned early on that the world would judge him first by his skin color and second by his capabilities. His single mother, a hospital nurse who worked double shifts to support him and his two younger sisters, had instilled in him an unshakable work ethic and a quiet dignity that would become his trademark. James had worked his way through college, taking out student loans and holding down 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a near-perfect GPA at UC Berkeley. Even with his impressive academic credentials, he faced constant discrimination throughout his early career. At his first tech job, colleagues often mistook him for janitorial staff. During his rise through several Silicon Valley companies, he was repeatedly passed over for promotions that went to less qualified white colleagues. Rather than become bitter, James channeled these experiences into motivation. At 32, he founded TechVision with his life savings of $50,000. The company specialized in innovative security software, and through James's brilliant leadership and technical expertise, it had grown exponentially over the past decade. Now, TechVision employed over 500 people with offices in 4 countries, and James had become a respected figure in the tech industry. But success hadn't changed his fundamental nature. James remained humble, fair, and committed to helping others from disadvantaged backgrounds. He funded scholarships for minority students interested in STEM fields, mentored young black entrepreneurs, and insisted on diverse hiring practices within his company. His employees described him as firm but compassionate, demanding excellence but always leading by example. On this particular Thursday morning in April, James was traveling with his executive assistant Zoe Ellis. Zoe had been with him for 5 years, rising from an entry-level position to become one of his most trusted team members. At 29, she was ambitious, efficient, and fiercely loyal to James, having witnessed firsthand his integrity and dedication. The purpose of their trip was significant. James was heading to San Francisco for a meeting that could result in TechVision acquiring a promising Silicon Valley startup for $75 million. The deal would not only expand TechVision's product line but also save the struggling startup from bankruptcy, preserving jobs and innovative technology. James was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored navy suit and subtle platinum cufflinks, his one indulgence and a gift from his mother when TechVision had hit its first million in revenue. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing his laptop and the detailed acquisition proposal he had spent weeks perfecting. Despite his wealth and status, James had never forgotten the sting of discrimination. He had developed a particular philosophy for handling it. He remained calm and dignified, chose his battles carefully, and when necessary, used his position not for revenge, but to create lasting change. As Flight MH249 prepared for departure, he had no idea that his philosophy would be put to the test in a very public way. JFK International Airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy on that Thursday morning. Travelers rushed to gates, announcements echoed through the terminal, and harried airline staff directed the flow of humanity with practiced efficiency. James and Zoe had arrived 3 hours early, as was James's habit. He'd learned that punctuality gave him a buffer against the extra scrutiny he often faced while traveling. They spent their waiting time in the exclusive first-class lounge where James reviewed acquisition documents while Zoe confirmed their hotel and transportation arrangements in San Francisco. Even in this rarefied space, subtle microaggressions found them. When James approached the refreshment counter, the attendant asked to see his lounge access card, something she hadn't requested from any of the white executives who'd gone before him. When he ordered a sparkling water, she handed it to Zoe instead of him, assuming she was the one in charge. James exchanged a knowing glance with Zoe, but said nothing. These were the paper cuts of racial bias, individually, minor, collectively exhausting, and sadly familiar. At boarding time, they made their way to Gate 27. Despite the first-class priority boarding announcement, the gate agent stopped James scrutinizing his ticket with unnecessary thoroughness. "Sir, are you sure you're in first class?" she asked, even as his boarding pass clearly displayed first-class seat 2A on both the paper and her screen. "Yes, I am," James replied evenly. "As is my colleague." He gestured to Zoe, who stood beside him, her expression carefully neutral. The agent checked his ID against his ticket 3 times before reluctantly allowing them to board. Behind them, a white businessman in first class walked through with barely a glance at his documents. On the plane, they were greeted by a flight attendant named Desiree Jackson, whose warm smile contained no trace of suspicion or judgment. She directed them to their seats with professional courtesy. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington. May I offer you a pre-flight beverage?" James settled into his spacious seat by the window with Zoe across the aisle. The first-class cabin was half filled with the usual mix of business travelers and wealthy tourists. A few nodded at James in recognition. His face occasionally appeared in business publications, while others were absorbed in their phones or laptops. As other first-class passengers boarded, James noticed the head flight attendant, a blonde woman whose name tag read Meredith Carter. She was efficiently helping passengers stow luggage and take their seats, but he couldn't help but notice how her smile tightened when she looked his way. When the co-pilot emerged briefly from the cockpit to speak with the flight crew, James overheard a fragment of conversation that made his shoulders tense. "Is that James Washington in 2A?" The co-pilot asked, his name badge identifying him as Richard Bennett. Meredith nodded, lowering her voice. "Keep an eye on him. You know how they can be." The unmistakable emphasis on "they" sent a familiar chill up James's spine. He maintained his composure, pretending to be absorbed in his phone, but Zoe had heard it too. Her fingers tightened on her tablet, and she threw a disgusted look at the crew members. "Let it go," James murmured. "Not worth it." "Until it is," Zoe replied quietly, knowing her boss well enough to recognize when he was picking his battles. James took a slow sip of his sparkling water. Years of experience had taught him to differentiate between the slights he could ignore and the situations that demanded action. For now, he would wait and see. He had an important meeting ahead and preferred to arrive without incident. The boarding continued, with the economy passengers filing past first class toward the back of the plane. James focused on reviewing his notes for tomorrow's acquisition meeting, pushing the crew's prejudice to the back of his mind. But something told him this wouldn't be the last of it. The cabin crew's attitude had already set the stage for what was to come. The plane was nearly ready for takeoff. The boarding door was about to close when a commotion erupted at the entrance to the aircraft. A loud, authoritative voice carried through the cabin. "I don't care what the system says. Figure it out." Heads turned as Senator William Preston boarded his presence, commanding immediate attention. At 62, with silver hair and an expensive suit, he radiated entitlement. Behind him scurried his aide, Ryan Miller, a nervous young man clutching a leather portfolio and looking apologetic toward the flight attendants. "I'm so sorry about the confusion," Miller was saying to Meredith Carter. The senator's reservation was supposed to be in first class. There must have been a system error. Meredith's entire demeanor transformed as she addressed the senator. Gone was the perfunctory professionalism. In its place was a deferential smile, an eager-to-please attitude. I completely understand, Senator Preston. Let me see what I can do to fix this unfortunate situation. James watched the exchange with mild interest before returning to his documents. Seat mix-ups happened all the time. The flight was full according to the gate announcement, so he assumed the senator would have to accept whatever seat was assigned to him. He was wrong. A shadow fell across his tray table. Looking up, James found Meredith standing beside his seat wearing a plastic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone artificially sweet. "We have a situation, and I was hoping you might help us out." James set down his papers. "What seems to be the problem?" Meredith glanced back at where Senator Preston stood in the aisle, then leaned closer to James. "We have a very important passenger who needs a seat in first class. I was wondering if you'd be willing to move to economy. We'd be happy to refund the difference in fare." James blinked, processing what he'd just heard. Across the aisle, Zoe had stopped typing and was listening intently. "I'm sorry," James replied calmly. "I booked and paid for this first-class seat. I need to prepare for an important meeting tomorrow, and I intend to remain here." Meredith's smile faltered slightly. "I understand, but this is a very special circumstance. Senator Preston is a VIP customer with our airline, and there seems to have been a mistake with his reservation." "That's unfortunate," James replied. "But I don't see how his reservation problem should become my problem." Meredith's expression hardened. "Sir, we're asking for your cooperation. Surely you can understand the senator's position." The implication was clear in her tone. Surely someone like you should accommodate someone like him. By now, other first-class passengers were watching the exchange. A white woman in her 50s across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. An older Asian man 2 rows ahead pretended to read his newspaper while clearly listening. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Zoe spoke up, her voice controlled but firm. "Excuse me, but why are you asking Mr. Washington specifically to move? There are other passengers in first class." Meredith barely glanced at Zoe. "We've assessed the situation and determined this would be the most appropriate adjustment." "Based on what criteria?" Zoe pressed. Instead of answering, Meredith turned back to James. "Sir, we need to resolve this quickly so we can depart on time." Senator Preston had been watching impatiently from the aisle. Now he stepped forward, addressing Meredith as if James weren't even there. "Is there a problem? I have an urgent meeting in San Francisco." "We're trying to sort it out," Senator Meredith assured him. James looked directly at the senator. "The problem appears to be that you don't have a first-class reservation while I do. And this flight attendant is asking me to give up my seat." The senator finally looked at James, taking in his immaculate suit and confident posture. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Clearly, James didn't match his mental image of someone who belonged in first class. "Look," Senator Preston said, addressing James directly for the first time. "I fly this route twice a month. There's been a mix-up, and I'm sure the airline can make it worth your while to help resolve it." James remained composed. "I'm sure they could make it worth your while to sit in the seat you've been assigned as well." Meredith's face flushed with indignation. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." No, James interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not going to insist on anything. I purchased this seat. I have a confirmed reservation. I will be staying right here." As the confrontation escalated, James discreetly took out his phone and began recording audio of the exchange. Meredith noticed, and her eyes widened. "Sir, recording is not permitted during..." "Recording is permitted before takeoff, according to FAA regulations," James corrected her. "And given how this situation is unfolding, I think it's wise to document it." Other crew members had taken notice of the standoff. Another flight attendant, Desiree Jackson, watched from the galley with concern etched on her face. James caught her eye, and she gave him a subtle nod of support. The tension had broken through the usual bubble of first-class decorum. Passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. They were openly watching, some with sympathy for James, others with discomfort at the disruption of their privileged peace. The confrontation had begun, but it was far from over. The standoff in the first-class cabin had now drawn the attention of everyone within earshot. Meredith's cheeks flushed red with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment as her authority was challenged. She glanced nervously at the other passengers, many of whom were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper, "you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. We're simply asking for your cooperation." James remained seated, his posture relaxed but resolute. "And I'm simply declining to give up the seat I purchased. That shouldn't be difficult to understand." Meredith's fake smile vanished completely. "Perhaps you don't realize who Senator Preston is. He sits on several important committees and is a platinum-level member with our airline." "I don't care if he's the president," James replied evenly. "That doesn't entitle him to my seat." Senator Preston, growing visibly impatient, stepped closer. His aide Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Is there a problem here?" The authoritative voice belonged to co-pilot Richard Bennett, who had emerged from the cockpit. Tall and imposing in his uniform, he positioned himself beside Meredith, his body language clearly meant to intimidate. "This passenger is refusing to accommodate Senator Preston," Meredith explained, gesturing toward James as if he were being unreasonable. Bennett squared his shoulders and leaned down slightly. "Sir, I'd recommend you cooperate with the flight crew. Interfering with their duties can be considered disruptive behavior." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. James noticed how Bennett's hand had moved to rest on his hip, a stance of authority meant to cow him into submission. "I'm not interfering with anything," James replied calmly. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat. If anyone's disrupting the flight, it's the crew members attempting to force me to give up my seat without any valid reason." Zoe had taken out her own phone and was openly recording the interaction now. "For the record," she announced clearly, "you're threatening a passenger for refusing to give up a seat he paid for solely to accommodate another passenger who doesn't have a reservation for that seat. Is that correct?" First Officer Bennett. Bennett's expression darkened. "No one is threatening anyone. Put that phone away." "The FAA permits recording before takeoff and after landing," Zoe repeated James's earlier point. "We're still at the gate." By now, Senator Preston had moved directly into the conversation, addressing James directly but looking down his nose. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I have important business in San Francisco. Surely, whatever you're doing can be conducted just as well from economy class." James met his gaze steadily. "Senator, I have important business as well. I purchased this seat specifically so I could work during this flight." "I suggest you take whatever seat is available, or wait for the next flight if that's unacceptable." The senator's face reddened. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, Senator Preston," James replied. "The question is, do you know who I am?" Before Preston could respond, Bennett cut in. "Sir, this is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Otherwise, we may need to have security handle the situation." The threat was no longer veiled. Bennett was essentially threatening to have James removed from the plane. Several passengers gasped at the escalation. Desiree Jackson, who had been watching from the galley, stepped forward. "Richard, I don't think—" "Stay out of this," Desiree Meredith snapped. James remained outwardly calm, though his heart rate had increased. This was quickly becoming the kind of situation that could end with him being forcibly removed or even arrested, something that happened disproportionately to black passengers regardless of their status or behavior. He made a decision. "First Officer Bennett, are you threatening to remove me from this flight because I refuse to give up my rightfully purchased seat to accommodate another passenger?" "I'm saying that failure to comply with crew instructions can have consequences," Bennett replied stiffly. James nodded slowly. "I see. In that case, I think it's time to clarify exactly what's happening here." He turned to address the other passengers directly. Is anyone else in first class being asked to give up their seat, or is it just the black CEO who's being singled out? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others seemed to suddenly realize the racial dynamics at play. One older white woman spoke up. "They didn't ask me to move. My seat is the same class as yours." A middle-aged Asian man added, "Nor me. This seems very targeted." Meredith immediately backpedaled. "This has nothing to do with. That is, we simply thought." "You thought what?" James pressed. "That I wouldn't know my rights, that I would be intimidated into giving up my seat, that I must not really belong here." The confrontation had reached a critical point. What would happen next would determine not just the outcome of this flight, but potentially send ripples through the airline industry and beyond. What would you have done if you were in James's situation? Comment number 1, if you think he should stand his ground no matter what. Or number 2, if you believe he should have avoided confrontation and moved seats. Has anything like this ever happened to you while traveling? Hit the like button if you're rooting for James to get justice in this situation. How do you think the airline staff will respond now that James has called out their discriminatory behavior in front of all the other passengers? What could possibly happen next that would shut down the entire flight? Let's find out as the story continues. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. James Washington sat calmly in his seat, surrounded by airline staff who seemed determined to remove him, while Senator Preston stood in the aisle with an expression of entitled impatience. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. The usual first-class bubble of tranquility thoroughly popped. James reached slowly into his breast pocket and removed a business card. The simple action drew all eyes to him. "First Officer Bennett, Miss Carter, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice measured and clear. "My name is James Washington. I'm the founder and CEO of TechVision Enterprises." He handed the business card to Bennett, whose expression shifted from authoritative to confused as he read it. Additionally, James continued, TechVision holds a 15% stake in Global Airlines Partners, which happens to be the parent company of this airline. The revelation landed like a bomb in the cabin. Bennett's face drained of color. Meredith's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Even Senator Preston seemed taken aback, the name TechVision clearly registering with him. James Washington, the senator, murmured, recognition dawning. "You were on the cover of Business Week last month." "That's correct," James replied calmly. "And beyond my role at TechVision, I also sit on the Transportation Security Advisory Board, which oversees regulatory compliance for airlines operating in the United States." He pulled out his phone again, but this time instead of recording, he dialed a number. The action was deliberate, unhurried. The cabin remained silent as everyone listened to his side of the conversation. "Maxwell, James Washington here." "Yes, good to talk to you too. Listen, I'm currently sitting on one of your planes at JFK flight MH249 to San Francisco, and we're having a situation I thought you should be aware of." James proceeded to describe the events that had transpired, his tone professional, but the content damning. Maxwell Reynolds, the CEO of the airline, was clearly responding with alarm on the other end of the line. "Yes, that's correct. Your head flight attendant Meredith Carter and First Officer Richard Bennett have threatened to remove me from the flight for refusing to give up my purchased first-class seat to accommodate Senator Preston, who doesn't have a first-class reservation." By now, several passengers had taken out their phones and were recording the scene. The incident was bound to go viral within hours. "I understand. I appreciate your concern." "Yes, I'll wait." James ended the call and looked up at the airline staff, whose demeanor had transformed completely. Meredith's face had lost all color, and Bennett looked like he might be sick. "Mr. Reynolds would like to speak with the captain immediately," James informed them. "He's also dispatching a customer service representative to the gate. It seems we'll be delayed a bit, folks." This last part he addressed to the cabin at large. The captain's voice came over the intercom moments later. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Frank Miller speaking. I've just been informed of a situation that requires my attention. We're going to have a slight delay in our departure. Please remain seated and we'll update you as soon as we have more information." Senator Preston, whose face had cycled through various shades of red during James's phone call, attempted to salvage his dignity. "Mr. Washington, I had no idea. There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding. I certainly never intended." "Save it." Senator James cut him off, not unkindly, but firmly. "This isn't about you. This is about a pattern of behavior that happens to people who look like me every day, whether they're CEOs or not." The senator's aide Ryan tugged at his boss's sleeve. "Sir, perhaps we should take seats in economy for now. We can sort this out later." But it was too late for a quiet resolution. The captain emerged from the cockpit, making his way down the aisle to assess the situation firsthand. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. "What's going on here?" Captain Miller asked, his gaze taking in the scene. Before Meredith or Bennett could speak, James addressed him directly. "Captain, I was just explaining to your crew that I won't be vacating my purchased first-class seat to accommodate another passenger regardless of their status. Your first officer and head flight attendant responded by threatening to have me removed from the flight." Zoe held up her phone. "We have the entire exchange recorded, Captain." Captain Miller's expression grew grave. "I see. Mr. Washington, I apologize for any inconvenience or disrespect you've experienced." "Senator Preston, I'm afraid we can't remove a passenger from their assigned seat. If you'd like to fly with us today, you'll need to accept your assigned seat in economy, or our gate agents can help you book a later flight." The announcement system chimed, and a voice came through. "This is the gate agent speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified of a situation on board. Flight MH249 will be delayed. We ask for your patience as we resolve this matter." Outside the aircraft windows, passengers could see a man in a sharp suit rushing across the tarmac toward the plane. Gregory Harrison, the airline's head of customer relations, had arrived in record time following the CEO's call. The power dynamics had shifted completely. The same flight attendants who had been trying to intimidate James minutes earlier now couldn't meet his eye. Senator Preston, realizing he'd backed the wrong horse in this confrontation, attempted to distance himself from the situation. "I was simply told there was a seat available," he muttered to no one in particular. "I had no idea they were asking someone to move." As Harrison boarded the plane and made his way to the first-class cabin, the other passengers broke into spontaneous applause. James nodded in acknowledgement but took no pleasure in the moment. This wasn't about humiliation or revenge, it was about accountability. For once, the system that so often worked against people who looked like him had worked in his favor. But James knew all too well that for every James Washington with the power to make a phone call to a CEO, there were thousands of black travelers who had no recourse when facing discrimination. That, he decided, would be his next battle after his meeting in San Francisco. The arrival of Gregory Harrison, the airline's head of customer relations, transformed the atmosphere in the first-class cabin. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with the airline's pin on his lapel, Harrison moved with the urgent efficiency of someone accustomed to putting out public relations fires. "Mr. Washington," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Greg Harrison, VP of Customer Experience. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you've received today." James accepted the handshake with a nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Harrison. Please call me Greg." Harrison turned to address the flight crew. "Captain Miller, I need to speak with you and your team privately." Captain Frank Miller, a 25-year veteran pilot with a reputation for running a tight ship, had already been assessing the situation. His weathered face was grim as he regarded Meredith and Bennett, who stood awkwardly in the aisle, their earlier confidence evaporated. "Of course," Miller agreed. First Officer Bennett, you and Miss Carter come with us." As the four moved toward the galley for their discussion, James could hear Harrison's voice, low but intense. "Do you have any idea the liability you've created for this airline?" The passengers in first class sat in an awkward silence, punctuated by the occasional ping of phones as some discreetly sent messages about the unfolding drama. Senator Preston had retreated to a seat in the first row, his aide whispering urgently in his ear, likely advising him on damage control strategies. Zoe leaned across the aisle toward James. "You okay?" she asked quietly. James nodded. "I'm fine. Just didn't plan on spending my morning this way." "For what it's worth, you handled it perfectly," she said. "Just the right amount of 'don't mess with me.'" James allowed himself a small smile. "Let's hope this leads to actual change, not just apologies." The intense discussion in the galley continued for several minutes. Through the curtain, passengers could occasionally glimpse Harrison's emphatic gestures and Captain Miller's stern expression. Finally, they emerged and Miller addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We're going to need a few moments to resolve a staffing matter before we can depart. I ask for your continued patience." With that cryptic announcement, Miller returned to the cockpit while Harrison made his way back to James. "Mr. Washington," Harrison said, taking the empty seat next to him temporarily, "I want to assure you that we're taking this matter extremely seriously. Miss Carter and First Officer Bennett will not be continuing on this flight." James raised an eyebrow. "You're removing them from duty." "Effective immediately," Harrison confirmed. "We're arranging for replacement crew members now, which should take approximately 45 minutes. I understand you have an important meeting in San Francisco, and I want to assure you we'll make every effort to get you there on time." James considered this. What happens to them after today? Harrison looked slightly surprised at the question. "There will be a formal investigation, of course, but given the evidence and the nature of their actions, termination is the likely outcome." James nodded thoughtfully. "I see. We'll also be offering you compensation for this inconvenience," Harrison continued. "A full refund of your ticket plus vouchers for future travel." "That won't be necessary," James replied. "But I would like to discuss something else with you once we're on the ground in San Francisco." Harrison looked intrigued. "Of course. Anything you need." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement requesting all passengers to stay seated as the cabin door reopened. Airport security officers boarded the plane, followed by 2 airline employees in uniform replacements for the removed crew members. Meredith and Bennett were escorted off the aircraft, their faces rigid with suppressed emotion. As they passed James's seat, Bennett kept his eyes straight ahead, but Meredith glanced at him, her expression a complex mixture of resentment and shame. Once they were gone, Desiree Jackson approached James with a fresh glass of sparkling water. "I'm so sorry about what happened, Mr. Washington," she said quietly. "Not all of us are like that." "I know," James assured her. "Thank you for your professionalism throughout this situation." The replacement crew members were introduced a new first officer named Captain Alicia Rodriguez and a senior flight attendant named Marcus Reynolds. Both greeted the passengers with warm professionalism, helping to diffuse the lingering tension. Gregory Harrison remained on board, personally overseeing the transition. As the new crew prepared for departure, he approached Senator Preston. "Senator, we have a seat available for you in Economy Class 14C, an aisle seat. Or if you prefer, we can book you on the next flight to San Francisco, which departs in 3 hours. Preston's face flushed with embarrassment. "This is outrageous. I'm a platinum member and a United States Senator." "I understand, Sir Harrison," replied evenly. "However, your reservation is for economy class on this flight. Those are your options." Several passengers watched this exchange with barely concealed satisfaction. The senator, realizing he had no leverage, eventually gathered his belongings and moved toward the economy cabin, his aide trailing behind. As the cabin settled into its new normal, James took out the acquisition documents he had been reviewing before the interruption. But before he could refocus on work, a flight attendant handed him a clipboard. "Mr. Washington, we need a formal statement about the incident for our records. Would you be willing to complete this form?" James looked at the standard complaint form with its tiny boxes for descriptions and realized how inadequate it was for capturing what had just occurred. "I have a better idea," he said, handing the clipboard back. "Instead of filing this away in some database, I'd like to meet with your diversity and inclusion team when we land. Let's talk about how to prevent this from happening to someone else who might not have the connections I do." The flight attendant looked surprised, then impressed. "I'll pass that request to Mr. Harrison right away." As preparations for takeoff resumed, James noticed other passengers looking at him with newfound respect. A few even leaned over to express their support and share similar experiences they'd witnessed or experienced. One elderly black woman from a few rows back made her way forward during the continued delay and touched his shoulder gently. "Thank you," she said simply. "My husband and I have been flying for 50 years, and we've been asked to move more times than I can count. Never had the power to say no like you did today." Her words affected James more deeply than the confrontation itself. This wasn't just about one incident or one flight. It was about decades of injustice that most people had to silently endure. As the woman returned to her seat, James made a silent promise to use this incident as a catalyst for real change. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've completed our crew change and will be departing shortly. We apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience." As the plane finally pushed back from the gate 90 minutes behind schedule, James looked out the window at the JFK tarmac. What had begun as a routine business trip had turned into something far more significant. The real work, he realized, would begin when they landed in San Francisco. The atmosphere aboard flight MH249 had transformed dramatically. Where tension had reigned just an hour earlier, there was now a strange sense of camaraderie among the passengers, particularly in first class. The shared experience of witnessing the confrontation had broken down the usual barriers that kept air travelers isolated in their personal bubbles. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the new crew moved through the cabin with efficient professionalism. Captain Alicia Rodriguez had briefly introduced herself to James before takeoff, a warm handshake and a knowing look conveying her understanding of the situation. "We'll get you to San Francisco safely and on time, Mr. Washington," she had promised. The head flight attendant, Marcus Reynolds, was equally impressive, courteous to all passengers, but taking special care to ensure James and Zoe had everything they needed. "Can I get you anything else?" Mr. Washington, Marcus asked as he collected James's empty water glass. "I'm fine, thank you," James replied. Then, after a moment's consideration, he added, "Actually, I'm curious about something. How long have you been with the airline?" 15 years next month," Marcus answered proudly. "And in your experience, how common are incidents like what happened today?" Marcus glanced around to ensure no other crew members were within earshot. "More common than the airline wants to admit, sir. Not always so obvious, but yes, it happens." James nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to talk more about that when we land, if you're willing." "I'd be honored," Marcus replied before continuing his duties. Gregory Harrison, the customer relations VP, had remained on the flight, an unusual move that signaled just how seriously the airline was taking the incident. He approached James's seat once the seatbelt sign had been turned off. "Mr. Washington, I've arranged for a car to meet you at SFO. It will take you directly to your meeting. We want to ensure you don't miss it, despite our delay." "I appreciate that," Greg James said. "But I'd like to discuss something more important than my transportation." Harrison took the seat across the aisle that Zoe had temporarily vacated to use the lavatory. "I'm listening." Firing Meredith and Bennett might address this specific incident, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem, James began. "I'd like to propose something different." Harrison leaned forward, intrigued. What did you have in mind? Instead of termination, what about comprehensive diversity training? Not just for those two, but for all your customer-facing staff. Make them part of the solution rather than just removing the problem. Harrison looked surprised. That's remarkably generous of you, Mr. Washington. Most people in your position would want heads to roll. I'm not interested in punishment, James explained. I'm interested in change. Firing them might make the airline feel better, but it won't help the next black passenger who boards one of your planes. They continued discussing the possibilities, a revised training program, updated policies for seat reassignments, and a transparent reporting system for discrimination incidents. By the time Zoe returned, they had sketched the outline of a comprehensive initiative. This is exactly the kind of expertise we need, Harrison admitted. Would you consider consulting with our team on implementing these changes? I'd be happy to have my DEI specialists at TechVision collaborate with your team, James offered. No charge. Meanwhile, in economy class, Senator Preston was experiencing something unfamiliar. The discomfort of a middle seat in row 14, wedged between a sleeping grandmother and a man whose large frame spilled over the armrest. His aide Ryan was seated several rows behind him, unable to offer any buffer against this new reality. As the meal service began in first class, complete with real silverware and hot towels, Preston could only watch with envy from his cramped position. When the economy meal cart finally reached his row, the options had dwindled to a single-choice pasta with a sauce of indeterminate origin. Back in first class, James was finally able to review his acquisition documents. Zoe worked across the aisle occasionally, passing him notes or questions. Despite the morning's drama, they were still on track for tomorrow's meeting. About halfway through the flight, James was surprised when a familiar figure appeared beside his seat. Desiree Jackson, the flight attendant, who had shown him respect from the beginning. Mr. Washington, I just wanted to thank you, she said quietly. What happened today? It needed to happen. You didn't seem surprised by their behavior, James observed. Desiree shook her head. Meredith and Richard have a history of special treatment for certain passengers. Many of us have complained, but nothing ever changed. She hesitated, then added, until today. Before returning to her duties, Desiree handed him a folded napkin. Inside was a list of names and dates, incidents similar to his own that had been reported but never addressed. James carefully tucked it into his briefcase. As the flight continued, several passengers approached James to express their support. A young black entrepreneur asked for his business card. An older white couple apologized on behalf of people who don't know any better. A South Asian family thanked him for standing up for himself, saying it had inspired their teenage daughter. Even more surprising was when Senator Preston himself made his way forward during a period of light turbulence, gripping seatbacks for support as he navigated the aisle. Mr. Washington, he began awkwardly. I believe we got off on the wrong foot. James looked up from his laptop. That's one way to put it, Senator. Preston had the grace to look embarrassed. I want to clarify that I never asked them to move you specifically. I simply mentioned needing a first-class seat, and they assumed I was the most appropriate person to displace. James completed the thought. That's precisely the problem. The senator hesitated, then lowered his voice. You mentioned sitting on the Transportation Security Advisory Board. I chair the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation. Perhaps we should discuss these issues further when we're on the ground. James studied him for a moment. I'd be interested in that conversation, Senator, particularly regarding the enforcement of anti-discrimination regulations in the airline industry. Preston nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This incident had created an unexpected connection between two powerful men who might otherwise never have had reason to collaborate. As the senator returned to economy, James turned to Zoe with a slight smile. Sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways. "You mean sometimes racism backfires spectacularly," she replied with raised eyebrows. James chuckled. "That too." The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their initial descent into San Francisco International Airport. James looked out the window at the California coastline emerging through scattered clouds. What had begun as a routine business trip had evolved into something much more significant. As the plane began its descent, he reflected on how this incident might create ripples far beyond one confrontation on one flight. Sometimes it took a public display of discrimination to catalyze meaningful change. And James Washington was now in a unique position to ensure that this particular incident would not be forgotten or dismissed. The landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud. They were about to touch down in San Francisco, but for James, this journey was just beginning. As Flight MH249 made its final approach into San Francisco International Airport, James Washington found himself in a reflective mood. The Golden Gate Bridge was visible in the distance, partially shrouded in the city's characteristic fog. Below the bay glittered in the afternoon sunlight. It was beautiful, but James's mind was elsewhere. "Penny for your thoughts," Zoe asked, noticing his distant expression. "Just thinking about how differently this day could have gone," James replied. "If I hadn't been who I am with the connections I have." Zoe nodded, understanding. "You'd have been the angry black man escorted off the plane while everyone watched in uncomfortable silence." "Exactly." James straightened his tie a habit when he was processing complex emotions, and it wouldn't have made the news, wouldn't have caused any change. Just another day in America. The seatbelt sign illuminated as the plane began its final descent. James secured his tray table and returned his seat to the upright position, his movements automatic after years of business travel. Flight attendant Marcus Reynolds moved through the cabin, checking that all passengers were prepared for landing. When he reached James's row, he paused. "Mr. Washington, Captain Rodriguez asked me to let you know she'd like to speak with you after we land if you have a moment." "Of course," James replied, curious. When the plane touched down on the runway with a gentle bump, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the passengers. Not the usual appreciation for a smooth landing, but something more, a collective acknowledgement of the journey they'd shared. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Desiree Jackson approached James's seat one last time. "Mr. Washington, I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to tell you something." Her voice was quiet, meant for his ears only. 10 years ago, my father was removed from a flight in similar circumstances. He was a respected doctor, but that didn't matter when someone decided he didn't belong in first class. James listened intently, recognizing the pain behind her professional demeanor. "He never flew again after that," she continued. "The humiliation was too much. He drove everywhere, even cross-country. When he passed away last year, he had 3 unused flight vouchers in his desk drawer." "I'm sorry," James said, simply understanding the weight of her story. "Don't be," Desiree replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Today, watching you stand your ground, it felt like justice for him too. So thank you." Before James could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their arrival at the gate. As the passengers prepared to disembark, he noticed Gregory Harrison speaking intently into his phone near the front of the cabin, occasionally glancing his way. "I think our story might have preceded us," he murmured to Zoe, who followed his gaze. "Good," she replied. "Let them sweat a little." As the first-class passengers began to gather their belongings, James remained seated, allowing others to exit first. Several stopped to shake his hand or offer words of support as they passed. One older white businessman leaned in and whispered, "My company has a large corporate account with this airline. After what I saw today, I'll be reconsidering that arrangement unless I see real changes." When the cabin had mostly emptied, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit. In person, she cut an impressive figure, tall and poised with her dark hair neatly secured beneath her cap. She approached James with a professional smile. Mr. Washington, thank you for your patience today, she began. I wanted to personally apologize for your experience. You have nothing to apologize for, Captain James assured her. You weren't even on the plane when it happened. Nevertheless, as a representative of this airline and as someone who believes in dignity for all passengers, I'm deeply troubled by what occurred. She hesitated, then added, and unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident. James nodded. So, I've been told. There's a cultural issue that needs addressing, Rodriguez continued. Some of us have been pushing for changes for years, but it's difficult without support from the top. Perhaps today will be a catalyst, James suggested. That's my hope, she agreed. And actually, that's partly why I wanted to speak with you. When we got word of what happened, several of us crew members from diverse backgrounds started a text chain. We've been wanting to formalize a diversity and inclusion committee within the airline for some time. This might be the moment to make it happen. James felt a spark of genuine optimism. Captain, I'd be very interested in supporting that effort. They exchanged contact information and Rodriguez thanked him once more before returning to complete her post-flight duties. As James finally rose to leave, he found Senator Preston waiting in the jetway just outside the aircraft door. Mr. Washington, Preston said, extending his hand. I've been thinking about our brief conversation. I believe there's an opportunity here. James shook the offered hand cautiously. What kind of opportunity, Senator? My subcommittee is reviewing airline passenger rights next quarter. In light of today's experience, I think we need to specifically address discrimination in air travel. Would you be willing to testify? It was a surprising turn of events. The same man who had expected James to vacate his seat hours earlier was now inviting him to help shape policy. I would be very interested in that, Senator James replied. My schedule is tight, but this is important enough to make time for. As they walked together toward the terminal, Preston revealed something unexpected. You know, my father was a civil rights attorney in the 60s. He'd be ashamed of how I handled myself today. Sometimes we need a sharp reminder of our blind spots. James considered the man beside him in a new light. It's what we do after the reminder that matters, Senator. In the terminal, a small group of airline representatives waited, including Gregory Harrison and a woman James didn't recognize who was introduced as the airline's chief diversity officer, a position that, based on the day's events, seemed to hold little actual influence. Mr. Washington Harrison began, "We've arranged for a private car to take you directly to your hotel or your meeting, whichever you prefer." Thank you, James replied. But first, I think we should talk about next steps. For the next 30 minutes, standing in a quiet corner of the terminal, James outlined his vision for meaningful change, not just sensitivity training, but structural reforms to how complaints were handled, how crews were composed, and how incidents were tracked. Senator Preston occasionally added his thoughts, the political weight of his position lending additional gravity to the discussion. By the time they finished, Harrison looked both overwhelmed and inspired. This goes far beyond what I expected, he admitted. But you're right, it's what's needed. As they wrapped up their impromptu meeting, James felt his phone vibrate with a text from Maxwell Reynolds, the airline CEO. Just reviewed the incident report and witness statements. Need to speak with you as soon as possible. This changes everything. James showed the message to Harrison, whose eyes widened. He never reaches out directly to anyone. Seems like today is full of firsts, James observed. As he finally headed toward the waiting car with Zoe, James reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple request to move from his rightfully purchased seat. What could have been just another humiliating experience for a black traveler had instead become a potential turning point, not just for one airline, but perhaps for an industry. Well, Zoe said, as they settled into the luxury sedan, this certainly wasn't the trip we planned. James smiled. Sometimes the most important journeys take us places we never expected to go. As the car pulled away from the terminal, he opened his laptop to review his notes for tomorrow's acquisition meeting. He was still a businessman with a $75 million deal to close. But now he was also something more, a catalyst for change in an industry that had long needed it. The wheels were in motion both literally and figuratively, and James Washington was ready for whatever came next. 1 month later, James Washington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechVision's Oakland headquarters, gazing across the bay toward San Francisco. The view never failed to center him, especially on days like today when he needed perspective. A gentle knock at his office door broke his reverie. Zoe entered, tablet in hand. "They're ready for you in the conference room," she announced. "Everyone's on the video call, including Senator Preston and the airline executives." James nodded, straightening his tie. "And our acquisition team? The integration is proceeding ahead of schedule," Zoe reported with a smile. "The Silicon Valley startup's employees are thrilled, especially since you decided to keep their Oakland office open rather than consolidating." "Good people shouldn't have to relocate to keep good jobs," James replied simply. The past month had been a whirlwind of activity. The acquisition had gone through smoothly, adding cutting-edge cybersecurity tools to TechVision's portfolio and saving 300 jobs in the process. But alongside his regular business responsibilities, James had taken on another mission, working with the airline to implement meaningful changes following the incident on flight MH249. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had blossomed into something neither he nor the airline could have anticipated. The day after landing in San Francisco, James had received a call from Maxwell Reynolds, the airline's CEO. What started as a profuse apology evolved into a 3-hour conversation about institutional biases and the challenges of changing corporate culture. "I've been in aviation for 30 years, Reynolds had admitted, "and I've never had someone explain these issues so clearly. We need to do better." Today's video conference was the culmination of 4 weeks of intensive work. As James entered the conference room, he was greeted by faces both in person and on the large screen mounted on the wall. His team of diversity specialists sat around the table while on screen were Reynolds, Harrison, Captain Rodriguez, and to James's surprise, Senator Preston. "Good afternoon, everyone," James began, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Let's review what we've accomplished so far and discuss next steps." Gregory Harrison took the lead, sharing his screen to display a comprehensive presentation. "Following Mr. Washington's recommendations, we've implemented several key changes to our policies and procedures." The list was substantial. 1. A complete overhaul of the airline's approach to handling first-class seat reassignments with clear guidelines that prohibited discriminatory practices. 2. A new anonymous reporting system for employees to flag incidents of bias or discrimination without fear of retaliation. 3. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all customer-facing staff developed in consultation with TechVision's DEI specialists. 4. The formation of an employee-led Diversity Advisory Council with Captain Rodriguez as its inaugural chairperson. 5. A transparent tracking system for discrimination complaints with quarterly reports to be made public. "And what about Meredith Carter and Richard Bennett?" James asked, curious about the fate of the 2 employees who had triggered this chain of events. Reynolds leaned forward on screen. "As you suggested, Mr. Washington, we didn't terminate them. Instead, they've been reassigned to non-customer-facing roles while they complete an extensive training program. Bennett has been surprisingly receptive, actually. He's acknowledged his behavior and seems genuinely committed to learning from the experience. And Miss Carter." A slight pause. "She's progressing more slowly, but she's completing the requirements." James nodded, satisfied. His goal had never been punishment, but education and change. People rarely grew from being cast out. They grew from being held accountable while given the chance to do better. Senator Preston cleared his throat. "On the legislative front, I'm pleased to report that our subcommittee has scheduled hearings on discrimination in air travel for next month. Mr. Washington, Your testimony will be crucial in helping us craft effective regulations." "I'll be there," Senator James assured him. The meeting continued for another hour, diving into metrics and milestones. When it concluded, Reynolds had one final announcement. "Mr. Washington, in recognition of your contribution to improving our airline, we'd like to establish the James Washington Scholarship for Minorities in Aviation. Each year, we'll fund 5 students pursuing careers in aviation, from pilots to aerospace engineers to hospitality specialists." James was genuinely moved. That's more than I expected. Thank you." After the video call ended, James remained in the conference room with his team. Thoughts, concerns, areas where we need to push harder. His head of DEI, Dr. Amara Okafor, spoke up. "It's a good start, James, but the real test will be sustainability. What happens when the spotlight fades? When the next quarterly report shows a dip in profits? These initiatives are often the first to be cut when times get tough." James considered her point. "You're right. We need to build in safeguards, make this part of their DNA, rather than just a response to a PR crisis." He made a note on his tablet. "Let's develop some long-term accountability measures before we conclude our consulting relationship." Later that afternoon, as James prepared to leave for the day, he received an unexpected email from Desiree Jackson, the flight attendant who had supported him during the incident. "Thought you might want to see this," the message read, with a link to an internal airline newsletter. The featured article highlighted the newly formed Diversity Advisory Council, with quotes from employees of various backgrounds discussing how the incident on flight MH249 had sparked long overdue conversations throughout the Macianos company. One paragraph stood out. "For years, many of us saw these problems, but felt powerless to address them. It took one passenger who refused to be treated as less than human to create the opening we needed." Sometimes change requires someone with the courage to stand their ground, even when surrounded by people telling them they don't belong there. James felt a complex mixture of emotions reading those words. Pride in what had been accomplished, sadness that it had been necessary hope for continued progress, and an acute awareness that his position of privilege had made it possible for his resistance to be effective where others might not have been. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Saw you on the news again. Making waves as usual. So proud of you, baby." He smiled. His mother had always taught him to stand up for himself, but to do so in a way that opened doors for others behind him. Today, he felt he'd honored that teaching. 6 months later, James Washington boarded another flight, this time to Washington, D.C., for his testimony before the Senate subcommittee. As he settled into his first-class seat, he noticed something different. The flight crew was notably diverse, and the lead flight attendant greeted him by name without checking his boarding pass twice. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington," she said warmly. "We're honored to have you flying with us today." As other passengers boarded, James opened his briefcase and reviewed his testimony one last time. The document outlined his experience, but focused primarily on systemic solutions, concrete steps airlines and regulators could take to ensure that all passengers were treated with equal dignity and respect. The final paragraph read, "What happened to me on flight MH249 was not unique. What was unique was my ability to do something about it. My hope is that the changes we implement today will create a world where everyone has that same ability, where dignity is not a privilege for the powerful, but a right for all." A young black man in his 20s stopped in the aisle beside James's seat, his expression one of barely contained excitement. "Mr. Washington, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm starting pilot training next month on the James Washington Scholarship. You changed my life, sir." As the young man continued to his seat in economy, James felt the full-circle nature of the moment. What had begun as an attempt to displace him had instead created space for a new generation to soar. "Sir, we're about to depart. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" the flight attendant asked. James closed his briefcase and smiled. "No, thank you. I have everything I need." As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, James Washington watched the ground fall away below the perspective shifting as they climbed higher. Sometimes it took rising above to see the full picture to understand how small moments could create lasting change. The journey that had begun with a confrontation in first class had transformed into something far more significant than one man keeping his seat. It had become about ensuring that everyone had a seat at the table, not just on airplanes, but in the rooms where decisions were made, policies were crafted, and futures were determined. And that James reflected as the plane banked toward the nation's capital was a journey worth taking. This story teaches us that true power lies not in wielding authority for personal gain, but in using it to create lasting change for others. James Washington could have simply enjoyed the vindication of keeping his seat and seeing those who discriminated against him punished. Instead, he chose a path that transformed an ugly incident into meaningful progress. When faced with discrimination, our instinct might be to seek retribution or withdraw entirely. James showed us a third option, strategic engagement that addresses root causes rather than symptoms. By focusing on systemic change rather than individual punishment, he ensured that his experience would prevent countless similar incidents for others who might not have his advantages. The story also reminds us that privilege comes with responsibility. James recognized that his position gave him leverage that many others lack when facing discrimination. Rather than seeing this as mere personal fortune, he viewed it as an obligation to create pathways for others. Perhaps most importantly, this narrative demonstrates that lasting change requires collaboration across divides. From Senator Preston to Captain Rodriguez to the young scholarship recipient, progress happened when people with different perspectives united around a common vision of dignity and respect for all. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wondered if speaking up would make a difference? Share your experience in the comments below. What stopped you from intervening, or what gave you the courage to act? Your story might inspire someone else to find their voice. If this account of standing up against racial discrimination resonated with you, please hit the like button so more people can discover it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful racism stories that highlight both the challenges we face and the progress we're making together. Has someone ever stood up for you when you were treated unfairly? Tag them when you share this video to let them know the impact they had on your life. Sometimes people never realize how their actions ripple outward to create lasting change. Thank you for joining me for this journey into courage, dignity, and transformation. Remember, in a world where you can be anything, be someone who makes the path easier for those who come after you. Until our next story, may you have the wisdom to recognize injustice and the courage to address it, no matter where you sit.